Physical representations of Roman emperors on coins and in busts gives us an idea of what they looked like. But the real question, of course, is, what did those guys smell like? So, today, we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like for an ancient Roman emperor. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other hygiene-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time to bathe in some weird history. Through the first half of the 1st century, Roman men commonly wore their hair and facial hair long. But Julius Caesar didn't, and when he came to power, he became a model for shorter hair in general. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Caesar was somewhat overnice in the care of his person, being not only carefully trimmed and shaved, but even having superfluous hair plucked out. Suetonius also tells us that Caesar was balding, and apparently pretty upset about it, because he knew his political enemies and detractors mocked him for it. So what would Caesar do? The same thing many men still do to hide their bald spots. As Suetonius reports, he used to comb forward his scanty locks from the crown of his head, and of all the honors voted him by the Senate and people, there was none which he received or made use of more gladly than the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all times. Yeah, you heard that right. Julius Caesar had a comb-over and liked to wear hats. And since powerful people often double as trendsetters, this look became the norm for emperors, and Greek barbers were brought to Rome to maintain cleanly shaven appearances. In fact, it wasn't until Hadrian, over 70 years later, that another Roman emperor wore a beard, and even he may have only done so to hide skin deformities on his face. Emperor Tiberius was called handsome by Suetonius, though the author also noted that he would break out on a sudden with many pimples. Acne was not without remedy during the 1st century. In fact, medical writer Aulus Cornelius Celsus produced an entire treatise on health, cleanliness, and the treatment of various diseases and afflictions, including skin problems. When it came to removing pimples, Celsus prescribed the application of resin, to which not less than the same amount of split alum and a little honey has been added. Then a mixture of equal quantities of galbanum and soda pounded in vinegar to the consistency of honey should be smeared on the affected area. After several hours, that should be washed off and the area should be anointed lightly with oil. That being said, Celsus didn't really think the whole procedure was worth the trouble. And in his De Medicina, he wrote, "To treat pimples and spots and freckles is almost a waste of time." In many ways, Roman bathing practices were consistent regardless of class. Emperors and common folk alike used a strigil, which is essentially a small sickle, to wipe away sweat and oil. After exercising or bathing, Romans would cover themselves in oil. Then they used a strigil to scrape it off into a gutus, or small pitcher. The process was devoid of soap and was followed by a cold water rinse. Wealthy individuals had slaves scrape them, while the poor had to do it themselves. Excess use of the strigil, however, could have negative consequences. While the rinse after a good strigil scrape was meant to restore moisture, the process was irritating to the skin. Strigils were also quite sharp. Suetonius even speculated that Emperor Augustus's numerous callous places resembling ringworm were caused by a constant itching of his body and vigorous use of the strigil. Public bathing in Rome was a communal activity enjoyed by members of the lower classes. Wealthy Romans would often have private baths, but as the Roman Empire expanded, bathhouses were built in small and large settlements alike. Emperor Hadrian was a common presence at public baths, which was welcomed by other patrons. According to contemporary reports, he often bathed in the public baths, even with the meanest crowd. On one occasion, Hadrian was at a public bath when he saw a veteran he used to serve with. The man was rubbing his back and the rest of his body against the wall. Hadrian asked why he was doing that, and the man replied that it was because he did not own a slave. Apparently moved, Hadrian presented the man with some slaves and the cost of their maintenance. This act prompted others to try the same thing, in hopes of receiving the same reward. But that hustle didn't quite work out. Instead, when Hadrian saw a number of old men rubbing themselves against the wall for the purpose of arousing the generosity of the emperor, he ordered them to be called out and then rub one another in turn. Well, it was a good try. Romans did not have soap in the modern sense, but they did find other ways to clean their clothes. And one of those ways was by soaking them in urine. We've talked about this in other weird history videos, but yeah, Romans used human and animal urine to strip clothes of dirt and oil. It's not as crazy or disgusting as it sounds because urine is, in fact, high in ammonia, which is a cleaning agent. Urine is also fairly easy to get. Traders would gather it from public toilets, and taxes levied on urine generated revenue to pay Roman troops, a plan first instituted by Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian's son, Titus, however, was repelled by this tax. According to Suetonius, Vespasian held a piece of money from the first payment to his son's nose, asking whether its odor was offensive to him. When Titus said no, Vespasian replied, "Yet it comes from urine." Talk about rubbing it in your face. Hadrian was a regular visitor at public baths, but Emperor Gallienus took things to a whole other level. According to reports, he indulged in as many as 6 or 7 baths a day during the summer months, and at least 2 or 3 a day in the winter. Emperors Gordian and Commodus were also said to have bathed often. The latter often took his meals in the bath. And, contrary to what you saw in Ridley Scott's 2000 film Gladiator, he would eventually be slain in the bathroom after being given a glass of wine laced with poison. Or it might have been meat. Reports conflict. Regardless of how the poison was delivered, it wasn't actually the toxic substance that ended Commodus's life. In fact, according to Cassius Dio, Commodus vomited some of the poison and then got pretty pissed off about the whole thing. His anger wouldn't last long, though, for Dio also tells us Narcissus, a wrestler and Commodus's fitness coach, went in and asphyxiated the emperor in his bath. That doesn't really tell us much about hygiene, but it does tell us maybe think twice about the person you hire as a fitness coach. Just like bathing in the Roman world, using the toilet was communal and lacked privacy. Public toilets had numerous seats lined up next to each other with holes that led to sewer systems, unless you happened to be one of the wealthy Romans, in which case you probably had a private toilet installed. At his villa near Tivoli, Emperor Hadrian, for example, commissioned several private toilets with marble seats and footrests. Many of the single-seat toilets were arranged in clusters near dining halls and designed for individuals of varying social ranks. Archaeological evidence shows that some of these toilets contained bubbling fountains, which would be used to rinse the sponges that Romans used to cleanse themselves. There is also evidence of foundations and sink-like structures where the sponges would have been kept. Though Hadrian and his fellow nobles may not have realized the health benefits at the time, private baths and toilets offered a more sanitary alternative to the public Roman bathhouses, which were rife with parasites and disease. Larger public bathing facilities in Rome were known as thermae. These were often commissioned by emperors and served as a location for socializing. Thermae featured dressing rooms with holes in the walls for patrons to store their belongings, a tepidarium that contained a pool of warm water, a caldarium that contained a pool of hot water, and a frigidarium, which contained a pool of cold water. Some thermes even had outdoor swimming pools, dry saunas, and a gymnasium. The very first thermae, which succeeded the smaller bathhouses that came before it, was commissioned by Augustus and designed by his chief deputy, Agrippa, in 25 BC. After that, Roman emperors began commissioning larger and more elaborate thermae for public bathing purposes. Though they didn't keep a formal court, Roman emperors often dined with friends, nobles, and family members. Behavior and fare at the dinner table depended on the emperor. Suetonius described Augustus, for example, as a light eater and as a rule ate of plain food. Suetonius, however, painted a much different picture of Claudius, whom he described as eager for food and drink at all times and in all places. In fact, according to Suetonius, Claudius hardly ever left the dining room until he was stuffed and soaked, and then he went to sleep at once, lying on his back with his mouth open, and a feather was put down his throat to relieve his stomach. Very attractive. Anyway, few Roman emperors cultivated such a gluttonous reputation, but even those with a taste for fine dining did so at the expense of their guests. Caligula, for example, reportedly forced some high-ranking senators to run in their togas for several miles beside his chariot, and to wait on him at the table, standing napkin in hand either at the head of his couch or at his feet. 2 centuries later, Elagabalus amused himself by enjoying a number of savory dishes while his fellow diners received only napkins embroidered with the food he was eating. That's a pretty lousy host. At the other end of the spectrum, there was Emperor Severus Alexander, who preferred clean, uncomplicated meals. Suetonius wrote that his banquets were neither sumptuous nor yet too frugal, but always characterized by the greatest good taste, and none but white napkins were used. Now that's classy. Take some notes, Elagabalus. Short haircuts were common among emperors, but few were proud of their thin or fading hairlines. Emperor Domitian, for example, was so unhappy about his hair loss, he had himself depicted in coins and statuary with a full head of hair and wore a wig later in life. One of his predecessors, Otho, also wore a hairpiece to hide the thinness of his locks. Suetonius claimed the wig was so carefully fashioned and fitted to his head that no one suspected it, or no one wanted to point out the emperor wore a rug. Emperor Caracalla wore a wig as well, but not to hide a balding head. During a tour of the empire, he became especially fond of the Germans, to the point that he preferred German clothes to his Roman cloak, and donned a yellow wig with the locks arranged in German style. The Germans, for their part, were delighted with the emperor's antics, and according to Suetonius, they became very fond of him, although this may have had more to do with his lavish gifts of money than his fashion sense. If you were a flea, rat, or louse, the 14th century was a good time to be alive because you were thriving in filth. Plus, you had a steady job spreading disease. A flea would bite a rat that was infected with the plague, and when the flea was hungry for its next meal, it would jump onto a human and bite them, transmitting disease from rat to human. Doctors of the era never identified fleas as a vector for the plague, so people continued to sleep on straw bedding that was teeming with vermin, never realizing the risks they were taking for their barely comfy bed. Europe wasn't very clean in the 14th century, and everything was pretty much covered in grime. Bathing did not occur every day for commoners. However, they knew grime wasn't cool, and most peasants began their day by at least washing their hands and face. Contrary to the stereotype, medieval Europeans did occasionally take baths. The rich bathed in private tubs, while everyone else visited public baths or dunked in the local stream. Bathing was identified as a treatment for the plague, but instead of bathing in water, some recommended bathing in vinegar and rose water. Vinegar, a common medieval medical treatment, was considered a great tool in stopping the plague. Plague doctors sometimes washed their hands in vinegar or placed vinegar sponges in their masks. And if vinegar wasn't powerful enough for you, you could follow other recommendations to take a bath in your own urine. That's a lot of urine. But washing in your own urine may sound like a decent option when you realize in medieval times, people had to make their own soap. This required a few ingredients: ashes from an oak tree, tallow, which is animal fat, lime, which was heated to become quicklime, salt, flour, water, a pot, a pan, fire, and a sturdy stick to stir with, not to mention a few days, and of course the knowledge of how to put it all together. Yeah, urine looks like an easier option. Even if you did practice superior hygiene, that didn't protect you from harm. In some areas, the Jewish population had a mortality rate lower than their neighboring Christians. This was likely because of their sanitary traditions. Instead of learning a few simple lessons from their healthy neighbors, Christians went with more complicated and decidedly brutal ideas. Some Christians believed Jews were resistant to the plague, accused them of tainting wells to spread the disease, and some felt the plague was actually punishment from God for allowing Jews to openly live in their community as, well, Jews. This led some Christians on a mission to convert, exile, torture, and sometimes kill their Jewish neighbors. This despite several popes declaring Jews had nothing to do with the plague. But mobs aren't known for their listening skills. Jewish communities were vilified, oppressed, and individuals were compelled to confess to nefarious deeds that they did not commit, just to avoid punishment, which didn't always save them. According to the Nuremberg Chronicle, in 1348 all the Jewish residents in Germany were burned, having been accused of poisoning the wells, as many of them confessed. In hindsight, it looks a lot like the lower infection rates were because Jewish hygiene practices required more hand washing than their Christian counterparts. Hand washing. Yeah, that seems more probable than God's wrath. Doctors in the 14th century had no idea how to effectively treat the plague, and in fact, many of their treatments actually spread the disease. For example, plague sufferers experienced swelling in their lymph nodes, called buboes. Doctors recommended cutting open the buboes and draining the pus to let the disease leave the body. Then to the wound, they would apply a mixture of plant roots, sounds good, resin, seems reasonable, and dried feces. Yeah, that ruined it. And never wanting to be wasteful, some recommended collecting the drained pus from the buboes to drink. An almost certainly fatal suggestion. Do I owe a copay for this? Fearing contamination, Europeans tried to avoid infection. But it wasn't just the walking afflicted that had to be dodged. It was also the dead. They were everywhere. Towns and cities struggled to dispose of the overwhelming number of cadavers during the plague. According to 14th century Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, many perished daily or nightly in the public streets. Of many others who perished at home, the departure was hardly observed by their neighbors until the stench carried the tidings. Another chronicler in Florence wrote, "All the citizens did little else except to carry the slain to be buried." Europeans had some things figured out and established sanitation policies to bury infected bodies in mass graves. These were to be located outside of town and in deep pits. But deep is relative, and keeping up with the body count was a never-ending task. Some cities were so overwhelmed that dogs dragged cadavers back into town through the streets. According to 14th century chronicler Agnolo di Tura, some of the burial sites were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged cadavers forth and devoured many. Before indoor plumbing, human waste created a public health crisis. In the 14th century, townsfolk might share one toilet among dozens of households. Pardon me, is this seat taken? Heavy rains and floods caused community cesspits to overflow, which sent human waste cascading into the local water supply. And if you didn't even like the idea of going to a place called the cesspit, much less the long walk to get there to dispose of your waste, many emptied their chamber pots directly into the street. Excuse me, Governor. Rats are not picky and will eat any food they can find, even discarded or undigested food mingled with feces. So these open sewers attracted rats with their friends the fleas, along with other vermin, all of whom were partners in disease transmission. Having begun to see the connection between effluence and disease, England's Parliament tried to stop people from dumping waste into the water supply. In 1388, the body declared so much dung and filth of the garbage and entrails be cast and put into ditches, rivers, and other waters, that the air there is grown greatly corrupt and infected, and many maladies and other intolerable diseases do daily happen. In the 14th century, Europeans believed foul smells spread disease. In an attempt to combat the plague, they carried sweet-smelling flowers and pomanders, which are small scented objects, to cleanse the air. The plague doctor costume became emblematic of the era. The bird-like mask worn by doctors held dried roses, herbs like mint, or spices thought to protect against infection. Doctors donned the mask and a full body covering when treating victims of the plague. The outlandish outfit may have indeed warded against infection, though not because of the herbs and spices. Being covered head to toe meant the doctors had unknowingly invented a medieval hazmat suit. In the 14th century, civilization had not yet reached the age of production, and consumers had little variety from which to choose. Not so for the Black Plague. You had a choice. The plague came in not one, but three varieties: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Bubonic plague spread via flea bites and infected the lymphatic system. Pneumonic plague infected the lungs after inhaling aerosolized bacteria. And septicemic is when the bacteria infects the blood through direct exposure or via lungs or lymphatic system. If you were unlucky, you contracted the bubonic plague, which had a survival rate between 25 and 75%. If you were very unlucky, you were infected with the pneumonic plague, which had a survival rate between 5 and 10%. And if you were very, very unlucky, you contracted the septicemic plague, which had a survival rate of, well, it really didn't have a survival rate. It was virtually unstoppable. It had a mortality rate of 99 to 100%. Interestingly, despite hundreds of years of medical advancements, the septicemic plague is almost always fatal, even today. A silver lining to the septicemic plague is that it's difficult to catch. Of course, if you do something silly, it increases your odds. Bloodletting was one of the most popular medical treatments in the 14th century. Doctors often treated fevers by bleeding their patients to remove heat from the body, and bleeding was used on plague patients. Doctors believed, partially correctly, that the plague infected the blood. As a result, they recommended cutting open veins to let the disease leave the body. However, the medical treatment also exposed doctors and others to the septicemic plague. Very, very, very bad luck. In the 14th century, Europeans often laid straws or rushes on their floors. Straw covered up the dirt floor in poor people's homes. While wildflowers were sometimes added to the rushes and the top layer changed occasionally, the bottom layers might remain for decades. In the 16th century, Erasmus, a Dutch philosopher and Christian scholar, was disturbed to find that in many homes, the bottom layer is left undisturbed, sometimes for 20 years, harboring expectoration, vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. These putrid rushes exhaled a vapor that was harmful to the health, Erasmus declared. They also attracted rodents and let bacteria flourish. It was an all-inclusive vacation resort for the plague. When the Black Plague struck, Europeans knew the disease was contagious. In some areas, cities tried to turn away ships that had visited infected areas to protect their population. In 1348, Venice became the first to enforce a 30-day isolation period for ships and travelers to make sure they weren't infected. In later outbreaks of the plague, the city extended the isolation to 40 days, giving birth to the term quarantine, from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. Unfortunately, even these efforts failed to stop the spread of the disease. Tens of thousands still perished in Venice. The doctor to Pope Clement VI, Guy de Chauliac, said the epidemic shamed Europe's doctors. They dared not visit the sick for fear of being infected, and when they did visit them, they did hardly anything for them. De Chauliac instructed Pope Clement VI to sit alone between two bonfires. The doctor claimed this treatment would cleanse the air and prevent infection. The fires may have had the unintended effect of keeping plague-ridden rats at bay, but combined with its forced isolation, it kept the Pope plague-free. The Black Plague wiped out tens of millions of Europeans, but history's deadliest epidemic had a surprising benefit, at least to those who survived. According to research by Dr. Sharon DeWitt, the plague improved the health and lifespan of people who lived through the epidemic. For 200 years afterward, people's diets improved, and they lived longer than pre-plague Europeans. Scholars point to several potential explanations for the improvements. The smaller population following the plague enjoyed higher wages and cheaper food prices, which helps explain the better diets. And survivors of the plague might have been hardier, since the plague eliminated so many people. Contrary to how most people view it today, folks in the 17th century didn't see hot water baths as a pleasurable indulgence or a hygienic necessity. In fact, many of them believed that bathing in hot water was actually bad for one's health. According to historian Jules Harper, the common belief was that warm water weakened the body and widened the pores, thus allowing diseases to enter. People everywhere, not just in France, found it much safer and better for the health to have a quick wash than soaking in a tub. King Louis himself was no exception. In fact, historians believe the so-called Sun King had only 2 baths over the course of his entire life. Très nasty. Now, that's not to say he never attended to his personal hygiene. He is known to have occasionally wiped himself down with a towel, scrubbed his body with perfume and alcohol, and washed his hands every morning. But sitting next to him at a dinner wouldn't be too easy on the olfactory sense. Now, as we established, Louis XIV wasn't too into bathing or showering, so when he got sweaty, he, like your old college roommate, would simply change his shirt. Louis and his courtiers changed shirts multiple times per day, a move that signaled both their money and status. However, though perfumes allowed users to mask unpleasant smells, body odor was still a major problem. Sadly for all involved, underarm deodorants wouldn't be widely used until the 20th century. In modern times, answering nature's call is typically a pretty private experience, but that wasn't always the case at Versailles. Louis XIV, for example, often took meetings with visitors while on the commode, as did other members of his court. Kind of gives a whole new meaning to doing your business. Despite this unnecessary openness, all inhabitants would have also had chamber pots or commodes in their private rooms. The higher ranking you were at court, the more likely you would have been to have a small closet in your chambers in which to do your business. For those of you wondering, the first flush toilet didn't arrive at Versailles until Louis XV, the Sun King's immediate successor, had one installed for his personal use in 1738. Though inhabitants had commodes and chamber pots in their private living spaces, Versailles had public-use latrines. But considering the sheer number of people on the estate, the supply was, to say the least, woefully inadequate. The combination of minimal toilets and high demand meant the latrines were under a tremendous strain. They often overflowed, and sewage seeped through the walls and floors into neighboring rooms. Versailles had limited plumbing, which meant that chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped out the windows. Passerbys would have to move with caution. And as we covered in our video on hygiene during the French Revolution, even Marie Antoinette was said to have once been hit by flying waste. Sacre Dieu! If the pots weren't dumped out the window, they would have to be transported to one of the nearby cesspools that collected waste. Given the lack of adequate plumbing and the density of people at the palace, many courtiers answered nature's call whenever and wherever it was most convenient. Seeing someone in the act of relieving him or herself wasn't an uncommon sight. The Princesse d'Harcourt, for one, didn't think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. In her words, "The people stationed in the galleries in front of our rooms piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartment without seeing someone peeing." Louis XIV finally made a point of directing servants to clean up the waste weekly. By all accounts, the stench of Versailles was horrendous and overpowering. According to one eyewitness, the unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, even the chateau, could make a person literally gag. The hallways, courtyards, and corridors were full of urine and feces, and the Avenue Saint-Cloud was covered with stagnant water and dead cats. So what did the courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They attempted to cover it up. Yes, most of the residents routinely doused themselves with generous quantities of perfume. As historian Alan Corbin put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. But it was ultimately counterproductive. The prevalence of perfumes only made things worse, since it added yet another fragrance to the already unbearable stench. Versailles was also a hotbed of liaisons amongst all classes. After Louis XIV moved his court to the former hunting lodge, workers and nobles alike descended on the town. According to people who were there at the time, the forest surrounding the palace grounds became a kind of open-air brothel, since sex workers could be solicited there. In light of what he deemed to be the immoral licentiousness of his court and kingdom, Louis vigorously policed sex workers and marked them as sinners. However, contrary to Louis's public stances on morality, he maintained numerous mistresses. A political leader saying one thing and doing the opposite? That's hard to believe. After a lifetime of dental problems, Louis XIV was toothless by the time he passed in 1715. His dental woes were bad, but they were far from unique. Decadent treats made with refined sugar began to be widely available in France in the 17th century. French aristocrats, who were apparently indifferent to the effects of poor dental care, gobbled them up, and it typically led to rotted teeth. Despite, or perhaps because of, the prevalence of rotten teeth, having a good mouth was important to many courtiers at Versailles and their beauty ideals. As described in the 17th century text, The School of Venus, a beautiful woman should have even and very white teeth. Courtiers used various powders and mouthwashes to give the appearance of healthy teeth. Thanks in part to improvements in dentistry, oral hygiene had become a mark of elegance by the middle of the 18th century. In an alleged bid to conceal his own thinning hair, Louis XIV had been credited with helping popularize those fancy wigs they used to wear in France. But the wigs did more than just conceal male pattern baldness. They protected against lice. Well, sort of. See, the lice often infested them instead of a person's scalp, and boiling a lice-covered wig was way easier than picking lice out of a person's hair. That being said, men typically shaved their heads in order to wear wigs and control lice, while women, by and large, did not. The hygienic conditions at Versailles also impacted food. The plumbing problems, for example, made life difficult for the palace's cooks. For example, on at least one occasion, sewage seeped into Marie Antoinette's private kitchens and poisoned everything. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. As a result, intestinal parasites lived within courtiers at Versailles. Even the king wasn't spared, and it is known that he had several bouts of tapeworm. In fact, during one of those bouts, Louis is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. Despite how famous it is today, Versailles was never really an obvious location for a royal court. Initially built as a hunting lodge, it wasn't near flowing water, which could whisk away waste. Worse, the site was built on what one observer called shifting sand and marsh. So when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. Making matters worse exponentially was the fact that Louis generally stayed put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces, as kings had previously done. This put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced. Versailles was filthy, but a great place if you happened to be a cat person. In fact, any visitor to Versailles would have seen cats, both domestic and feral, throughout the palace estate. Some members of court brought their own pets, and the heaps of food of waste attracted rodents, which in turn attracted the cats that hunted them. Of course, the presence of so many cats led to even more sanitation problems. Feline droppings could be spotted all over the grounds. Worse, the remains of deceased cats could be found along the town's main thoroughfare. The reddish-purple-brown color known as puce got its name at Versailles, amusingly, thanks to a pest. It happened in 1775 when Marie Antoinette wore a gown in that color, prompting her husband Louis XVI to compare the color to une puce, or a flea. Despite the comparison, the color caught on. In fact, according to the Baroness d'Oberkirch, every lady at court wore a puce-colored gown: old puce, young puce, ventre de puce, dos de puce, etc. Puce wasn't the only color to get its name at Versailles. After the birth of Louis XVI's heir in 1781, courtiers marked the occasion by wearing a new color. They called it caca dauphin, or dauphin poop, because it was as brown as the infant's excrement. And you thought comparing the color of a dress to a flea was unflattering. After Louis XIV passed in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandson inherited the throne as Louis XV. Recognizing the unhygienic and generally stinky state of the palace, Louis XV began several renovation projects aimed at cleaning things up a little. Chief among them was seeing to it that the sewage pipes were extended. This put a greater distance between the palace and its cesspools of human waste, which, if nothing else, had to be a good place to start. Issues with basic cleanliness cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides of the Civil War, exacerbating deaths from infection with the rapid spread of disease such as malaria, dysentery, and typhoid. Historian Drew Gilpin-Faust estimates that this number is nearly double the amount of Civil War soldiers who actually perished in combat. Enlisted men would undergo a medical examination before being sent off to fight, but these tended to focus exclusively on their physical and mental ability to handle combat. Whether they could stand up, march in a straight line, hold a rifle, and follow basic instructions were the primary considerations. As a result, the exams were not exactly thorough. In fact, many were so lax that, though women soldiers were forbidden from joining either army, at least 400 managed to successfully enlist as men over the course of the conflict. That kind of says more about the doctors conducting the exams. Bringing together so many individuals from across a large and diverse continent also brought along its own challenges. Soldiers who grew up in remote or rural areas often had not been exposed to common childhood diseases among city dwellers, such as chickenpox, measles, or the mumps. As waves of new recruits would arrive in camps, anyone without a fully armed immune system would likely succumb to one of these illnesses. Vaccination programs helped stem the spread of smallpox in the camps, but it remained a viable concern. To compound matters, though they were often required by commanders to bathe once per week, no one was really checking on the soldiers to make sure. It wasn't like Stonewall Jackson was going to be on the front lines sniffing everyone's armpits, so a lot of people ignored this requirement. Soldiers at the front would also frequently end up sharing or reusing one another's clothes. Uniforms were hastily being fashioned for both Union and Confederate troops, sometimes with subpar materials, leading them to fall apart quickly or fail to successfully keep troops warm during particularly cold nights outdoors. Many soldiers also didn't have access to sufficient footwear. An estimated one-third of Confederate soldiers went barefoot throughout the conflict. If you're fighting the Civil War and you're barefoot, the universe does not want you to succeed. Normally, having to share clothes is just kind of irritating, particularly if you're the youngest and your older siblings lack a sense of personal flair and style.
Come over here and look at yourself. They look amazing on you.
But in wartime, it can actually be a health hazard. For example, lice infestations became extremely routine, and the pests were easily transferred around camps where men were sharing clothes and living in tightly packed close quarters. More than a nuisance, lice could spread typhus, a common and deadly disease at the time. Lice became such a fact of life during the Civil War, they even made their way into popular culture. Soldiers would sometimes hold louse races, in which they'd put the bugs on a custom racetrack and set them against one another, sometimes wagering money on the winner. Louse fights were also reported, though it's unclear how these were officiated. Additionally, many soldiers, particularly undersupplied Confederates, would frequently steal boots and other clothing from the dead, imprisoned, or wounded enemy troops. This also contributed to the spread of disease, though not in as overwhelming and dire a way as the camps in which the soldiers lived. To put it in concrete terms, the tent camps alongside travel routes and battlefields where soldiers would live and sleep were pretty filthy, by any standard. This constant exposure to the outdoors and elements, in all kinds of weather, obviously led to a host of health complications among the troops. Though many were outfitted with a rubber blanket to protect them from the wet ground, these were heavy to carry, and many soldiers abandoned them in order to lighten their load. As a result, many soldiers slept on the wet or damp ground, which was sometimes ripe with mosquitoes or other pests. This led to an epidemic of skin diseases and also outbreaks of malaria. Malaria ultimately went on to post one of the highest KD ratios of the entire war, claiming the lives of over 10,000 soldiers and more than 1.3 million reported infections. The problem became so significant, Scientific American magazine started recommending that soldiers treat themselves with quinine as a preventative measure. Pneumonia was also another common illness, which took out an estimated 20,000 Union troops during the conflict. Almost 30,000 troops were infected by tuberculosis as well, leading to 7,000 early graves. One Union inspector at the time reported finding camps littered with trash and discarded food, some of it already in a state of decomposition. He also reported on the digging of pits just outside the camp's borders into which refuse, slop, manure, and offal would be cavalierly discarded. This was not only a health hazard, but it gave the camps a uniformly putrid, rotting stench, like an egg salad sandwich that expired 2 presidents ago. And if that weren't stinky enough, another major problem was human waste. Camps were outfitted with makeshift latrines and bathing areas known as sinks, which were usually little more than open ditches. Often, these latrines were placed near an area where soldiers would be sleeping. I mean, I get it, it's convenient for those late-night pee breaks, but that turns out to be a horrible hygiene practice. Life was generally more smelly back then. If the latrines were far away or occupied, sometimes soldiers would take care of their business elsewhere, in nearby trees and bushes, which could also serve as something of a biohazard if it was close to where people were sleeping or eating. Sometimes soldiers would dig their latrines too close to a local water source and contaminate the entire camp's drinking water. Medical authorities knew that boiling water would purify it, yet this simple technique wasn't widely practiced. As a result, many troops were infected by diseases that spread through contaminated water. The stress of being at war, combined with poor eating habits and malnutrition and the spread of illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, also led to mass cases of diarrhea and constipation. By some estimates, the Union Army alone experienced more than 1.5 million cases of dysentery or acute diarrhea during the conflict, and nearly 3/4 of Union soldiers experienced serious bowel complaints at some point during the war, mostly due to the lack of potable drinking water. Fresh fruits and vegetables were particularly hard to come by among the troops, and they didn't have Metamucil or probiotic yogurt hawked by Jamie Lee Curtis. So getting your daily fiber and keeping regular was a real issue. These conditions were also treated with quinine, as well as opium in some cases, if you were really lucky. At the time, it was believed that mercury mixed with chalk worked as a laxative, and even though that's incredibly toxic, it's also technically true. Your body will indeed begin to expel itself if you consume enough mercury. So it became a popular treatment as well. Though the dangers of drinking latrine water were already fairly well understood, medical science had yet to entirely wrap its head around concepts like food poisoning. Soldiers frequently dined off of unsanitary plates with dirty utensils, only to catch foodborne illnesses. This was a considerable enough problem to prompt the U.S. Sanitary Commission to specifically warn soldiers against using dirty dishes, recommending that they scour their pans rather than risk getting sick on the job. The Civil War went down just a few years before Joseph Lister published his landmark article, An Address on the Antiseptic System of Treatment in Surgery, in the medical journal Lancet in 1867. Lister outlined some simple techniques, including washing your hands and spraying wounds, surgical tools, and dressings with carbolic acid that help to kill infection-causing germs, leading to more positive surgical outcomes. Prior to Lister's innovations, the risk of wounds becoming infected, leading to conditions such as gangrene, remained extremely high. Often, surgeons were simply unaware of the importance of using clean and sanitary equipment, leading them to reuse the same surgical instruments on multiple patients. As these procedures were often going down during the heat of battle, with a long line of grievously wounded men waiting for treatment of their own, often the tools wouldn't even be rinsed down between operations. In particularly extreme cases, surgeons would resort to simply using their bare hands to root around inside patients looking for shrapnel, bits of bone, or other debris. If their hands were still dirty, or worse, covered in blood and body fluids from a prior patient, this put everyone at significantly greater risk of infection. Sponges that were covered in blood and pus would sometimes just get a quick rinse before being applied to another patient. Sponges would also sometimes be used in place of cotton rags among medics who were chronically under-equipped, especially in the South. Other doctors came up with, let's call them creative solutions, to common battlefield conditions, like using maggots to eat away at dead tissue around an infection, in the hopes that healthy tissue would grow in its place. The resulting infections, bringing with them so-called surgical fevers, had a higher mortality rate than the actual surgical procedures themselves. The risk of infection was so high, amputation was often the first and only available option for Civil War medics treating soldiers with significant wounds or injuries. That is why there are so many leg-sawn scenes in Civil War movies. However, while many of these movies indicate that battlefield surgeries in this era were carried out without anesthesia, with soldiers being given nothing but bullets or a belt to bite down on to deal with the pain, this is not historically accurate. Anesthesia was developed in the 1830s and was in regular use during the war. In fact, it's estimated that 95% of all Civil War surgeries were carried out under the influence of either chloroform or ether. Some historians estimate over 60,000 amputations were carried out on Civil War battlefields. And while those amputations may have saved the patients' lives, they could become a health hazard for everyone else. There was no proper and clean way to dispose of all those severed limbs, and piles of them would accumulate during large battles, as surgeons had to work quickly and move between many injured patients. At Gettysburg, a local boy named Hugh Ziegler was actually employed to help move around amputated limbs. He later recalled that the piles resembled stovewood, and were large enough to have filled a wagon bed. Imagine that's your first summer job, battlefield limb collector. It's better than a paper route. Some surgeons rejected the pile method and instead would place the severed limbs into large pits. There is a bit of light at the end of this grimy tunnel, though. A movement for public health reform had already started in U.S. cities by around the 1830s. But the Civil War clearly highlighted the need for improved hygienic practices among all Americans and gave the effort a natural boost. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was founded by civilians in 1861 to inspect Union camps and hospitals and provide guidelines for avoiding mass infections. Though obviously their efforts didn't entirely assuage the problems during the war, their work became an inspiration for post-war health and sanitation efforts, particularly in large cities such as New York, historically the cleanest city in America. Dust was everywhere in the Wild West, and heavy winds and dust storms were common. They would send clouds of dirt and grime into homes and businesses alike, while threatening the lives of both settlers and their livestock. According to one Sarah Raymond Herndon, a young girl who made the journey from Missouri to the Montana Territory in the late 1860s, the dust along the trail was almost knee-deep in some places. On one occasion, after walking 20 miles in one day, her party camped for the night. Sarah observed that the boys' faces were covered in so much dirt one could just see the apertures where eyes, nose, and mouth were through the dust. Being that the Wild West was wild, many people just relieved themselves in the woods. However, outhouses were also a common part of frontier life. Typically built close to houses and homesteads for reason of safety and convenience, the average outhouse was just a hole with a wooden structure erected above it. When the hole filled up, it was covered with dirt, and then the wooden structure would be resituated over a new hole, typically dug nearby. Outhouses, as you probably imagined, were not pleasant smelling, and people would often try to mask the foul odors with lime or lye. Bugs were commonly found inside outhouses, including flies and black widow spiders, the latter of which tended to bite people as they sat down to do their business. Have fun thinking about that next time you visit the loo. Modern toilet paper didn't exist yet, so people had to use whatever was available. This often included leaves, grass, and corn cobs. Youch! That's a real painful clean. While not all beds in the American West were made from hay and straw, most were. This being the case, the bedding material wasn't changed often, which typically led to infestations by lice and other things you probably wouldn't want to share your bed with. Known as seam squirrels, such infestations made sleeping less than hygienic. And if that isn't bad enough, flies commonly found their way into foodstuffs and human waste, and poorly insulated buildings were usually swimming in mosquitoes. Screens on windows were rare, so bugs could follow people from their homes to the outhouses and back, carrying with them particles of anything they'd pick up along the way. Surviving in the Wild West meant having a supply of clean water, and it wasn't always easy. Homesteaders would often build outhouses that would leak into the ground and contaminate the water for those who lived downstream from them, something that wasn't always known by the people who used the water. Rain would often be collected in cisterns, but that had its own issues. Dust and other contaminants were easily mixed in. Making the problem worse was that stagnant water would attract flies and other insects that would leave waste and excrement behind as they hovered over the water. In the interest of preserving the water they did have, people would often refrain from washing clothes or dishes. If they did clean such household goods, it would often be with used bath water. Speaking of which, when it came to bathing, entire families would often reuse the same tub of water over and over again for a week, sometimes even longer. There's nothing better than ending a long, hard day's work than sitting back and relaxing in a warm tub of family filth. Dirty family bathwater stew. Frank Clifford was an associate of Billy the Kid, who was also known to go by the names John Menem Whiteman and John Francis Wallace. Clifford wrote a memoir about his time in the American West that is notable for providing details of the soapweed Mexican women used to wash their hair. Made from the yucca plant, soapweed left the hair soft and clean and lustrous, and Clifford said he used it many times himself. Those who didn't favor soapweed made soap from animal fat, which was harsh and was known to cause skin irritation. Luckily, there wasn't much of an emphasis on washing. Body odor was just considered a natural part of life. In fact, it was widely believed that too much cleanliness endangered one's health by opening the pores to germs and diseases, so people had little motivation to bathe. Frank Clifford may have washed his hair with soapweed, but there were other forms of shampoo available. For example, whiskey. Yep, some cowboys were so tough, they literally had their hair done by Jim Beam. But as it turns out, whiskey had many uses in the Wild West, including everything from disinfecting to pain relief. When mixed with lavender and castor oil, it made for a fairly effective shampoo that was rinsed with rainwater or water softened with borax. As for the women, after a good brushing or combing, they would often curl their hair using heated pencils. Spit was a thing back in the Wild West. First off, the bars in most saloons had a rail or series of hooks that held towels patrons would use to wash excess beer foam off of their mouths. Hygiene not being much of a priority, the towels weren't washed between uses by different people, so they passed saliva from one patron to the next and aided in the spread of germs and diseases. But an even greater problem was that chewing tobacco was incredibly popular. The fronts of bars were also typically lined with spittoons and cuspidors for those who wanted to spit. The spit would be covered in sawdust, which seems like a common-sense way to dry it out, but it didn't actually work that well. Diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis ran rampant. Moreover, the sawdust itself became a breeding ground for germs, and since saloons often rented their floors to weary travelers, people would actually sleep right on the diseased muck. Things got so bad, some municipalities were moved to try and curb the excessive spitting or outright ban the practice. Spitting on train platforms and in train stations was made illegal and was punishable by a $500 fine, a year in prison, or maybe even both. Being a cowboy in the Wild West usually meant spending long days out on the range without bathing. For most cowboys, soldiers, and other men, their lack of cleanliness would only be interrupted by the occasional dip in a local river or stream. For obvious reasons, this was usually done during the warmer months, which meant that in winter, most guys just skipped bathing altogether. Women, on the other hand, were usually a little better. Emphasis on a little. They would typically wash their hands and faces in the morning. However, a lack of privacy, coupled with the average Western woman's sense of modesty, usually prevented much more than that. When it came to laundry, men usually went longer periods without washing their clothes as well. When they did bother, clothes were usually just rinsed in a river, stream, or whatever the closest water source was. Laundry, plumbing, and dishwashing in the Old West were usually accomplished with water that was also used for drinking, so it was very common for diseases to break out at camps and settlements. Cholera, for example, was both common and deadly, often ending the lives of settlers and Native Americans alike. In the 19th century, a series of cholera outbreaks among the Mormons claimed untold thousands of lives. The Mormons saw it as punishment from God and a test of their faith. At the same time, the disease was spreading from overland trails to tribal communities, where it was wiping out large numbers of natives. In 1873, there were cholera outbreaks in at least 18 states and territories. These outbreaks were often used as excuses to scapegoat unpopular communities. Such was the case in the Dakota Territory, where Russian immigrants were blamed by some from the medical community for bringing cholera to the territorial capital at Yankton. One doctor described the Russians as lower-class peasants who were filthy in their persons and their habits. They were blamed for the outbreak, though, and of course, it was actually part of a much larger epidemic. It's important to note that the hygiene practices in the Old West weren't monolithic. Different people from different cultures often took very different approaches to cleanliness and grooming. For example, while Westerns favored the straight razor for shaving, not everyone followed suit. Archaeological evidence found at Deadwood, South Dakota in 2005 supports the idea that the large population of Chinese immigrants who lived and worked there didn't shave at all. Rather, they would use tweezers to pluck their hairs out one by one. Ow, 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 ow. When visiting a town, your average cowboy was likely to treat themselves to a haircut, shave, and maybe, if they were feeling extravagant, some scented hair tonic. Like 80s glam rock stars, some of the most well-known figures from the Wild West wore their hair long. Among those with luxurious locks were James Butler Hickok, aka Wild Bill, as well as the notorious General George Armstrong Custer. Custer is even said to have scented his hair with cinnamon oil. The trends would turn back to shorter hair in the late 19th century. Tooth care in the Old West was a relatively primitive affair. Toothbrushes were uncommon. People would frequently use their knives to pick out food from between their teeth, and some stagecoach stops and public establishments would offer community toothbrushes. No thanks, I'll pass. If a tooth became problematic, it would usually just be pulled. Despite the existence of famous gunslinging dentist John Henry Doc Holliday, oral care professionals were incredibly rare. Those who needed a tooth pulled usually turned to barbers or blacksmiths, who would remove the sore tooth with tools that were basically fancy pliers. No anesthetic was used, but for pain management, patients were prone to taking a shot of whiskey, or 2, or maybe 3. Make that 4. Victorians had to do laundry just like everyone else, but they often used more than mere soap to get their clothing clean and fresh. For example, oil and grease stains would be combated by rubbing chalk into the fabric. Grass and blood stains, on the other hand, would be removed with kerosene, while other miscellaneous odors would be dealt with using milk. So far, these all sound like life hacks you might find in a modern YouTube video. But when it came to bleaching their clothes, the Victorians used a method modern folks probably wouldn't be too keen on. They soaked their clothes in their own urine. Asparagus. It sounds disgusting, but as it turns out, urine contains ammonia, which is a very effective cleaning agent. Except windows. Not very effective on windows. Trust me when I tell you that. Toothbrushes and toothpaste existed at the time and were available to the Victorians, but typically only the middle and upper classes. Most working-class folks had to get a little bit more creative. Toothpaste, for example, could be made at home using common ingredients that include things like chalk, soot, or even powdered cuttlefish. Toothbrushes of the era typically had wooden handles, harsh bristles, and weren't terribly comfortable to use. Despite this, they were relatively expensive, and those who couldn't afford them had to find alternate ways to clean their teeth. One common method was the use of celery, which was believed to be abrasive enough to clean one's teeth while being chewed. It was better than nothing, but as you probably guessed, it wasn't a medically ideal way to keep one's chompers looking good. Nonetheless, you'd want to do your best to protect your teeth because the dental care available at the time was, to be kind, utterly terrifying. Many areas didn't even have dentists, which meant if you needed oral care, you would probably have to go to your local barber or blacksmith. The earliest indoor toilets, also known as water closets, were both convenient and popular. But because they predated the invention of indoor plumbing, they had some undesirable drawbacks. With no pipes to carry away the waste, it often just dropped into a large cesspool that was located in the building's basement. While this arrangement was more accessible than an outhouse and less exposed than a chamber pot, the cesspool would eventually fill up. Once that happened, it didn't take too long for the whole house to start smelling, well, like a cesspool. To combat the stank, a cottage industry of night soil men sprung up. These laborers would empty the cesspool and then sell the waste to farmers, who needed it to use as fertilizer. They were known as night soil men because the laws of the era restricted the emptying of cesspools to nighttime, as the task was considered too disturbing to be undertaken in broad daylight. You would think something as simple as how to take a bath would be pretty intuitive to most people. You sit in water and wash yourself. But in Victorian times, that wasn't common knowledge. In fact, as regular or at least semi-regular bathing came into fashion, Victorians were besieged by publishers selling books that taught the uninitiated what to expect from a bath. Much of this guidance, though, was non-scientific. For example, one such book advised the curious and unwashed among Victorian society to avoid bathing within 4 hours of eating a large meal. This rule still exists today, though it's usually applied to swimming after meals rather than bathing. Another tip one might find in these books was to avoid washing their face when they traveled, unless they had the means to first purify the water with ammonia or alcohol. So-called Russian baths, which consisted of washing the face with extremely hot and then extremely cold water, were advised for those who were worried about preventing wrinkles. Today, pretty much everyone is obsessed with their hair. Victorian times were much the same, except that modern shampoos were still a ways off. So how did one clean their hair back then? Well, women of the era would typically use eggs. One would crack an egg over their head and then work the yolks into their hair like with a modern shampoo. The egg would then be washed out with a pitcher of water. Another popular option was vinegar diluted with water. That's gotta smell morning fresh. Eggs and vinegar weren't the only cooking-related items that made for a popular pre-shampoo hair cleaner. Rum, black tea, and rosemary were all considered normal and effective for hair washing. Cleaning one's hair is important, but maintaining a youthful and vital look is, to many, equally important. The Victorians were no different. To that end, Hall's vegetable Sicilian hair renewer, first introduced in the 1860s, became a staple of the era's hair care regimens. The product's main benefit was to darken hair in such a way that allowed people to hide their gray. Unfortunately for the people who used it, Hall's hair renewer used lead as a bonding agent. Its function was to aid other chemicals in darkening the hair, but it had the slight side effect of causing lead poisoning. Eventually, the company that manufactured Hall's managed to get the lead out, or at least most of it, in the formula, and the product managed to stay on the market well into the 1930s. Most people don't like a bad smell, but in Victorian times, bad smells were considered more than just unpleasant. They were believed to be downright dangerous. The idea that various conditions, including cholera and chlamydia, were spread through pollutants in the unclean air was called the miasma theory, or night air, and it dated back to antiquity. Victorians put a lot of stock in the miasma theory and blamed the poor health endemic in London's impoverished districts on wicked smells that floated through the streets. Even Florence Nightingale, one of the most famous nurses in history, believed it and thought that clean air would restore health to sick patients. While there was a connection between the bad smells and poor health, it wasn't the causative one Victorians believed. Turns out, the poor sanitation that was normal in industrial areas of the time was independently causing both the bad smells and many of the diseases. Victorian hygiene obviously had a lot of shortcomings, but it was also one of the first times in history that mainstream society took the time to address the concerns of feminine hygiene. Indeed, both the disposable pad and the earliest versions of the tampon were invented in the late 19th century. These new technologies took some time to become normal and widespread, and in the interim, women of the era got creative. It was discovered that the wood pulp base used to make the bandages typically used to treat the wounds of soldiers at war were also used for menstruation care. Ask anyone who lives in New York, London, or Hong Kong, and they'll tell you that in the heat of the summer, big cities, even modern ones, can develop a noxious smell. But the stench that emanated from London in 1858 was something else entirely. It was so unbearably heinous that the whole city practically shut down. During the Victorian era, the River Thames used to be the hub of the entire London sewage system. In practice, this meant that most citizens disposed of their waste by simply dumping it into the river. Londoners were not happy, and they raised quite a stink over the foul odors that came from the water. Doctors, in accordance with the aforementioned miasma theory, blamed the stench for causing rampant disease throughout the entire city. It was so horrible that the summer of 1858 would forever be known as the Great Stink. That's a t-shirt waiting to happen. From bad smells to evil spirits, many strange things were blamed for causing diseases in the past. Among the strangest, though, had to be the Victorian-era theory that tuberculosis and its spread was attributable to women's clothing. Doctors of the era theorized that long skirts dragging along the street were picking up the disease, and women who wore them were unwittingly bringing sickness into their home and spreading it to their families. The theory didn't stop at dresses, though. Doctors of the time also believed that the tight corsets women wore were also responsible for tuberculosis on account of the fact that they constricted the lungs. As such, doctors trying to stop the spread of the disease were prone to prescribing looser corsets and shorter skirts. Very fashionable. Despite being socially unacceptable during the Victorian era, escort work was a very common way for the women who lived in London's most impoverished neighborhoods to make a living. Sexually transmitted diseases were extremely common at the time, and without regular access to contraceptives, sex workers often transmitted those STDs to their clients. The clients, in turn, would then transmit them to their wives and anyone else they might be involved with. Things got so bad that the spread of sexually transmitted diseases was eventually declared a public health hazard. Laws were passed that allowed escorts to be detained by police and forcibly treated for STDs. Though it wouldn't be widely marketed until 1914, the mouthwash we know as Listerine was invented by Dr. Jordan Lawrence and chemist-turned-entrepreneur Jordan Wheat Lambert in 1879. Victorians were slowly beginning to accept notions of modern hygiene, so Lambert first tried marketing his concoction as a medical antiseptic. For whatever reason, the product was overlooked and failed to turn a profit for its creators. Not one to give up easily, Lambert began to suggest additional and often unusual uses for Listerine. Before he finally hit on selling it as a mouthwash, he tried marketing it as everything from a floor cleaner to a cure for dandruff and gonorrhea. In first and second class, Titanic passengers had access to public and private spaces with plenty of amenities. There was a gym, a massive swimming pool, and a grand squash court. But one of the finer amenities was the Victorian Turkish bath. Although using it required an additional fee, it remained popular as an overpriced massage parlor for the wealthy. The Turkish bath had rooms for massages, a steam room, and an electric bath. Resembling an iron lung in size and appearance, the electric bath was actually an early version of the modern tanning bed, meant to keep the body warm. It was a hot destination, to say the least. Men and women were not able to access the bath at the same time. Instead, 3 male and 2 female attendants were on standby to help out during business hours. When the ship sank on April 15, 1912, the 3 male attendants, John Borthwick Crosby, Walter Ennis, and Leonard Taylor, did not make it. But both women, Anne Karen and Maud Slocum, survived to tell their tales. While the Turkish bath was a popular amenity, regular baths were a bit more scarce. Singing in the bathtub sure can be fun, but most Titanic passengers didn't have that particular luxury. Only a scant few cabins throughout the ship featured a private porcelain tub at all. A fresh, relaxing dip in the tub could be yours, assuming you had enough wealth and status. Captain Edward Smith enjoyed his own tub from the comfort of his personal cabin. So did many of the first-class passengers occupying the B-Deck's multi-bedroom parlor suites. White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay famously occupied one of the fancy suites. But the most expensive suite went to Charlotte Cardenza, who brought along 14 trunks and 3 packing crates worth of stuff for the ocean cruise. But for those without access to fancy bathtubs, using public bathing facilities was a big part of the trip. What do you do when your massive ocean liner doesn't offer private bathing facilities for everyone? Offer public baths. And that's precisely what the Titanic did. Each deck had a communal lavatory for the passengers' bathing needs, but they had to make an appointment first. Making an appointment required speaking with the bedroom steward, who would then have the bath steward prepare a relaxing bath for the passenger. Of course, the availability of bathtubs decreased by passenger class. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the third class bore the brunt of these tub shortages. So much for luxurious baths. Oh, and did we mention third class composed 709 of the ship's over 1,300 passengers on its maiden voyage? Every one of them had to share one of 2 bathtubs for their bathing needs. Of the 2, one was exclusively for men and the other for women. Luckily, attendants cleaned and sanitized the facilities between each use. Speaking of facilities, sometimes it's hard to find a public restroom that isn't disgusting or completely unsanitary. But if nature called during your luxury cruise on the Titanic, you were in luck. The ship had plenty of restrooms, complete with stalls, commodes, and sinks. But only if you were riding in first class. First-class cabins had the finest soap and toiletries one could find on a big boat in the middle of the ocean. The fancy restrooms were stocked with high-end Vinolia toilet soap. Vinolia toilet soap was marketed as Vinolia Otto and made special mention of its status as the Titanic's soap of choice. It had some choice advertisement copy too, telling buyers it's perfect for sensitive skin and delicate complexions, and represents a higher standard of toilet luxury and comfort at sea. It's not as catchy as "You're not fully clean until you're zestfully clean," but we'll take it. While the first class got to scrub themselves with fancy soaps, the restrooms for the third class passengers were a little bit different. It wasn't uncommon to find a water closet and sink in a cabin aboard the Titanic, but finding an automatic toilet was a bit more difficult. In a bizarre twist, the first and second class cabins didn't have automatic flushing toilets. They were forced to flush them manually, just like at home. The third class, however, did have automatic toilets, but it wasn't done out of an altruistic reason. The Titanic provided them to steerage passengers out of concern they wouldn't know how to use a toilet. Since they mostly used outhouses and chamber pots in the past, they may not have realized the toilet should be flushed after use. The real question is, did the water swirl clockwise or counterclockwise? We may never know. Third class had even a toilet instructor, Matron Catherine Wallace, who helped teach them how to properly use the facilities. Sadly, she went down with the ship on that fateful night. Normally, procedures for boarding a ship are pretty straightforward. But on the Titanic, third-class passengers had to submit to a medical inspection prior to boarding the ship. The idea was to prevent lice, disease, or any possible infections from spreading among the ship. An infectious eye disease, trachoma, was also a major concern. But the health inspections didn't apply to everybody. First and second class were exempt from the medical screenings. They only had to stop at the purser's office to have their tickets checked prior to boarding. Men, women, and children with steerage tickets were met by a group of physicians outside the ship. They were then examined one by one and only allowed to board if declared healthy. If they were clean and healthy, they received an inspection card allowing them to board the ship. The Titanic had a knowledgeable and dedicated medical team, with a hospital and medication available to all passengers on the ship. Speaking of that hospital, British regulations at the time required the Titanic to hold a certain quantity of medical supplies before leaving port. But what did the ship's medicine cabinet look like exactly? There was bicarbonate of soda for indigestion and heartburn. Castor oil and Epsom salts were used to relieve constipation. And of course, they had plenty of the heart medication, digitalis, and aspirin. But the ship also carried laudanum to be used as a sleeping aid, chloroform for easing flatulence, and everyone's favorite hemorrhoid treatment, sulfur. Over on D-deck, the hospital was far removed from the passenger cabins. Even so, it was accessible to the passengers and the crew. It was state-of-the-art for the time. 4 wards contained 3 beds apiece, and a qualified medical staff was always on hand. The hospital also had an infectious disease area, complete with a ventilation system for preventing germs from having a cruise of their own. It was truly ahead of its time, but first-class passengers still insisted on bringing their own help. The Titanic had stewards and stewardesses to take care of passenger needs. But that wasn't always enough for first and second class travelers. They often brought their own secretaries and servants along for the ride. Instead of relying on ship personnel to dress and groom them, they relied on personal servants. Their status elevated them above Titanic crew members, too. Each received a silver-plated napkin ring with the word servant etched into it. Some of them perished when the ship sank, but others managed to get into lifeboats with their employers as the ship plunged into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Hired help weren't the only additional passengers in first class either. Several wealthy people also brought along their best friends. Amid all the luxuries first-class passengers received on the Titanic, bringing pets along is probably the most unexpected. The ship had a luxury kennel on F-deck, run by John Hutchinson and a group of stewards. There were at least 12 dogs on board. Smaller pooches were allowed to run free in their owners' cabins, but the big dogs required daily exercise. The stewards walked them along the poop deck daily and cleaned up after them. Dogs weren't the only passengers from the animal kingdom. Several roosters and hens roosted on the Titanic, owned by Ella Holmes White. White was importing the chickens to the U.S. from France. She survived the sinking of the ship, later testifying the ship broke into 2 as it sank. But a cat named Jenny was the most adorable pet on board. Well, as adorable as cats can get. Jenny was the ship's cat, who gave birth to a litter of kittens before the Titanic left Southampton. She and her family lived in the corner of the galley, tended by the ship's staff. Sadly, many of the pets did not survive the disaster, but 3 dogs did. A Pomeranian named Lady, who belonged to Ms. Margaret Hay, managed to get into the lifeboat with her owner. Hay wrapped her in a blanket as she boarded the lifeboat. Another Pomeranian, owned by Elizabeth Jane Rothschild, was brought aboard a lifeboat in a very similar way. A Pekingese named Sun Yat-sen also survived the disaster. She belonged to the famous publisher Henry S. Harper, the director of Harper & Brothers. Today, many know the company by a totally different name, HarperCollins. But on that night, he took his dog aboard the lifeboat to the objection of almost no one. Apparently, there was plenty of room on the boat. For historian J. Joseph Edgett, Harper was heard to remark, "There seemed to be lots of room and nobody made any objection." One of the side effects of having fancy cutlery and cookware is the crazy amount of care they needed. The silverware was fancy. Silver plating adorned napkin rings, plates, and bowls. Even the cookware had gold lead lining. The Titanic employed an entire team of stewards to act as busboys and dishwashers. They had assistants who washed plates and glasses. Even their assistants had assistants to handle the cleaning duties. The ship also provided meals on less elegant dishes to third class. This was unusual for the time, as most ocean liners required steerage passengers to bring their own food. There was also a ton of laundry. Third-class passengers and crew washed their clothes in iron tubs themselves, but first and second class paid to have their garments laundered. There weren't any large-scale laundry services aboard the ship. It was a specialty job held by stewards like Thomas Baxter, Sidney Holloway, and Ernest Olive. In addition to laundry, they kept linen closets fully stocked and changed first-class bedding daily. Soiled linens and towels were steam cleaned and bagged, so they could be cleaned once the ship reached its destination. It was standard practice at the time, keeping things clean for a large number of passengers on board. The whole zero-gravity thing looks pretty fun, but it actually makes a lot of average, everyday tasks a huge pain in the interstellar ass. For example, washing oneself can be a little tricky. Why? Well, zero-G makes standard sinks and showers completely useless in space, as the water would float away instead of flowing down a faucet. In order to wash their hair, an astronaut has to use a waterless shampoo that does not require rinsing and does not produce foam. Some water may be used to aid in the process via direct application to the scalp, but it must be carefully dried with a towel afterward to prevent damage to any equipment. Nobody wants to be the one to bring down the International Space Station because they didn't get all the Prel out of their ears. And if they brush their hair, an astronaut needs to be careful of any stray hairs that float away. Stray hairs can potentially get into an astronaut's eyes or be inhaled into their lungs, which immediately makes zero-G sound a lot less fun. Maybe that's why so many aliens are bald. Speaking of showers, an astronaut shower is more like a sponge bath than a tub and shower head with running water. Astronauts use a pouch that contains a mixture of rinseless soap and water. In fact, it's the same kind of soap used in hospitals for patients who are otherwise unable to bathe. It's also the same mixture and method that astronauts use to wash their hands. In this way, showering in space is more or less like applying lotion to your skin. The astronauts squeeze out a portion of the soap and water mixture and simply rub it onto their bodies. Whatever water is left in the air is then repurposed by the spacecraft. So you don't really bathe so much as get greased up for all mankind. Unsurprisingly, the one thing astronauts miss the most while on a space mission is running water. A sponge bath lotion shower just isn't the same. It also might not be as effective. Jennifer Lavasseur, who is a curator in the museum's Space History Department, said that many astronauts from the ISS describe the odor of the space station as having a lived-in smell, which is a polite way of saying it smells like old van carpeting or a gymboree. Luckily in space, no one can hear you scream about the smell. NASA has a lot of rules for astronauts to follow regarding personal hygiene and full-body cleansing. After an astronaut takes a shower, they need to make sure to dry both their body and the shower area completely. Even small droplets of floating water can find a way into equipment or an astronaut's lungs, either of which would be very bad. Each crew member is given 3 towels per day, 1 wet towel and 2 dry towels. All of the towels are bath-sized. In addition, wipes containing both disinfectant and lotion can be used as needed. If they need more than that, they're out of luck. So, no accidents. Luckily, they don't make freeze-dried Taco Bell. For astronauts who like a clean-cut look, shaving in space is not as complicated as many other hygiene rituals. In fact, shaving in space is a lot like shaving on Earth. Astronauts use a razor and shaving gel. The big difference is there is no running water to rinse off with, and the shaver needs to be extremely careful to use a tissue to wipe away hairs and any remaining shaving cream. Leftover particles can easily float away and become a major respiratory hazard or cause equipment malfunction. It would be kind of like that episode of The Simpsons where Homer goes into space and accidentally releases potato chips and ants into the zero-G atmosphere of the shuttle. That was a good episode. But I guess it'd be a lot less funny if it happened in real life. Why can't life be like cartoons? Some opt to not shave at all, resulting in a few astronauts with big, bushy playoff beards, like they're ready to go back clean up for the Marlins as soon as their shuttle touches down at Cape Canaveral. Hair still grows in space, but hair salons are generally much harder to find. Well, until NASA starts leasing retail space to help keep the lights on. So for astronauts spending months aboard the ISS, haircuts become part of their personal hygiene ritual. As with everything, it's important to keep hair from floating around the space station. For a safe and clean haircut, an astronaut will use a special set of clippers, which are attached to a vacuum. The vacuum suction takes in and disposes of all the hairs that are removed. So it's exactly like the suck cut from the beginning of Wayne's World. Who knew we were seeing space-age technology? If you have any interest in space, you've probably spent some time wondering what it's like to go to the bathroom up there. Well, we've got some answers for you. On average, it takes an astronaut about 10 extra minutes to use the toilet, which incidentally doesn't look like a standard toilet, but is actually just a metallic base that has a suction feature. And it's relatively tricky compared to its Earth-bound equivalent. Astronauts even have to go through space's version of potty training to make sure they are doing all the necessary steps. First, an astronaut must secure themselves to the toilet seat using special leg straps that prevent them from floating away, which would be bad. Having a bathroom emergency in zero gravity isn't exactly the kind of thing you can train for. Or can you? If they need to go number one, the astronaut uses a personal funnel, which is attached to a hose on the wall and works like a vacuum. The vacuum's fan sucks up the liquid and dumps it into a tank. If the astronaut has to drop off some moon rocks, they need to put a special bag inside the toilet to hold the waste. Next, they use a vacuum to contain the waste and a fan to freshen the air. The closed bag is then stored underneath the toilet until it can be safely disposed of. Makes you wonder how Chewbacca managed. He's so tall and all that hair. Oh man, what a mess. Today, NASA has the filtration technology to recycle urine into safe drinking water. However, solid waste is not yet recyclable. And good luck trying to convince anyone to drink that. So what do they do with it? Well, after an astronaut produces solid waste, it is sucked up into a sealed bag. The airtight sealed bag is then stored in a tank with other trash until the tank is full. The waste is then placed into an unpiloted ship and sent into space. The spacecraft is ultimately burned up in the atmosphere upon re-entry. Researchers are currently trying to figure out ways to utilize solid human waste. One idea is to use the recycled waste to line the walls of a spacecraft to protect astronauts from toxic cosmic rays. A poop shield. Well, that would have made Star Trek Voyager more interesting. Brushing your teeth might be even more important in space than it is here on Earth. That's because of the atmospheric changes on a spacecraft, which can give a cavity the potential to be even more painful. For dental care, a space station is rigged with tiny pieces of Velcro that hold capless toothpaste tubes for easy application. An astronaut can then wet their toothbrush by using a straw in a water bag. Without a sink to spit in after they're done brushing, they either swallow the toothpaste, which is specially made to be edible, don't try that at home, or they spit into a washcloth. There are no laundry machines for astronauts up in space since they would use up way too much water. So, how do space travelers keep their clothes clean? The answer is, they don't. There is no magical solution or way to wash clothes in space. Some space missions can last for months or longer, so there isn't a lot of extra room for clothes. Therefore, astronauts must wear their clothes for as long as possible, basically until the smell gets to be too much to bear, or until they disintegrate, whichever comes first. At the ISS, astronauts are told to wear their underwear about a week before changing it. Once a garment has reached its maximum tolerable stink level, astronauts throw out their clothes with the spacecraft's other waste. The garbage is placed in a vessel which burns up once it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere. You gotta hope none of that stuff ever makes it through. Hate to think of that family picnic at Galveston Bay getting rained out by flaming astronaut waste. Just like you would bring a toiletry bag on vacation, every astronaut is given a personal hygiene kit before taking off on a space mission. These kits feature all the hygiene basics like deodorant, soap, hairbrush, toothpaste, toothbrush, dental floss, shavers, body cream, and lip balm. Astronauts can even select which brands of items they prefer to use, which is important because it's not like they can make a CVS run in the middle of a mission. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman to travel into space, which gave the literal rocket scientists at NASA some unexpected trouble when stocking her personal hygiene kit. For example, while preparing for her flight, NASA asked if 100 tampons would be the right number of tampons for the week-long mission. Ride joked back that half of that amount would be just fine. Engineers also added makeup to the prototype hygiene kits of female astronauts, because what woman wouldn't want to put on makeup while floating around in week-old underwear and carefully bagging their own excrement? Those prototypes included all the cosmetic basics like eyeshadow, blush, mascara, and eyeliner. Eventually, it was determined that those items were not necessary. Maintaining a clean space station is just as important for astronauts as personal hygiene. Astronaut Clayton C. Anderson, a 30-year NASA employee who worked at the ISS on 2 separate occasions, said that the ISS systems did a lot of the cleaning work because the space station was equipped with HEPA filters. However, he explained that he was required to clean the ISS every Saturday morning for 2 to 4 hours. Anderson was typically able to perform all the cleaning tasks in less time than required, which consisted of wiping down all the handrails and equipment and vacuuming filters and vents to prevent a reduction in airflow. Even in space, you still have to do chores. So what do you think? Would you be able to live on a space station? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.